Welcome to the British Library. Thank you all so much for being here in the home of words and people who love them. We're here to celebrate the brilliant exhibition, Medieval Women in Their Own Words. And it's that key part of in their own words that makes it so special, so compelling. I'm sure many of you have visited the exhibition. Yes, I can tell. And we have a lot of repeat offenders coming back again and again to our events, which has been wonderful. Thanks, Sarah. Do you want to just sit on the end? And I should let you know that there are 2 more events still to take place. The exhibition runs until the end of this month, I think, or a couple of days into March. So you've still got time for just a little bit more medieval women. Tonight's event, Tales of Time, explores the impact of medieval women's words into the here and now and into some of the most impactful fiction of recent years. You will have time for questions, and that is extended to our very much beloved online audience. Hello, online audience. There's a massive online audience tonight. Thank you for joining us. And of course, there will also be signings of the books, and you can also buy the books online. And of course, without buying the books, you don't get these wonderful events. So I do exhort you to make good and to get your book signed and to knock yourself out. Buy all of the books that are out there. The signing will take place outside in the lobby. We're incredibly lucky tonight, before the conversation kicks off, to have managed to capture the unbelievably talented and luminous Lisa Dwan, who is an Irish actor, writer and director, and she will be giving us a very important and lucid performance of some of the writings that the inspiration has been drawn from. So you're in for a real treat. Lisa is very well known for her Beckett performances and her theatrical work, but you'll know her from the telly, from Top Boy. She's fresh off the set of a new Guy Ritchie series, which is going to be on Paramount, but you can tell everyone that you saw her here at the British Library. She's our favourite actor. So Lisa will be giving us readings from Pearl and from Julian of Norwich, and from Book 1 of Margery Kempe.
Good evening. Pearl. I've gazed 100 times at the place she left me, grieving for that gift which swept away all shadow, that face which was the antidote to sorrow. And though this watching sears my heart and wrings the wires of sadness tighter, still the song, this silence sings me, is the sweetest I have heard. The countless quiet hours in which her pale face floats before me, mired in mud and soil, a perfect jewel spoiled, my spotless pearl. In the place where such riches lie rotting, a carpet of spices will spring up and spread, blossoms of blue and white and red, which fire in the full light facing the sun. Where a pearl is planted deep in the dark, no fruit or flower could ever fade. All grass corn grows from dying grain, so new wheat can be carried home. From goodness, other goodness grows. So beautiful a seed can't fail to fruit, or spices fail to flower, fed by a precious, spotless pearl. So I came to this very same spot, in the green of an August garden, height and heart of summer, at Lammas time when corn is cut with curving scythes. And I saw that little hill where she fell was a shaded place showered with spices, pink gillyflower, ginger and purple gromwell, powdered with peonies scattered like stars. But more than her loveliness to the eye, the sweetest fragrance seemed to float in the air there also. I knew beyond doubt that's where she lay, my spotless pearl. Caught In the chill grasp of grief I stood in that place, clasping my hands, seized by the grip on my heart of longing and loss. Though reason told me to be still, I mourned for my poor imprisoned peril, with all the fury and force of a quarrel. The comfort of Christ called out to me, but still I wrestled in willful sorrow. Revelations of Divine Love by Julian of Norwich. At the same time as I saw this bodily vision, our Lord showed me spiritually in a vision how intimately he loves us. I saw that he is everything that is good and comforting and helpful to us. He is our clothing that enwraps us and enfolds us, embraces us and wholly encloses us, surrounding us out of tender love, so that he can never leave us. And so, in this vision, as I understand it, I saw truly that he is everything that is good. And in this vision, he also showed me a little thing, the size of a hazelnut, lying in the palm of my hand. It was as round as a ball, as it seemed to me. I looked at it and thought, what can this be? And the answer came to me in a general way like this: it is all that is made. I wondered how it could last, for it seemed to me so small that it might have disintegrated suddenly into nothingness. And I was answered, in my understanding, it lasts and always will, because God loves it. And in the same way, everything has its being through the love of God. And in this little thing, I saw three properties. The first is that God made it. The second is that God loves it. And the third is that God cares for it. But what is that to me? Truly, the maker, the lover, and the guardian. For until I am of one substance with him, I can never have love, rest, nor true happiness. That is to say, until I am so joined to him that there is no created thing between my God and me. And who shall do this deed? Truly, himself, through his mercy and grace, for he has made me for this, and blessedly restored me. With this, he brought to mind Our Lady. I saw her in a spiritual manner, but in her bodily likeness, a simple and humble girl, young in years, in the form that she was when she conceived. God also revealed to me in part the wisdom and the truth of her soul. And in this, I understood the reverent contemplation with which she beheld our God, who is her maker, marveling with great reverence that he was willing to be born of her who was a simple creature of his own making. For it was this that she wondered at, that he, who was her creator, was willing to be born of her who was created. And this wisdom and faith, recognizing the greatness of her maker and the littleness of her created self, caused her to say humbly to the angel Gabriel, "Behold me here, the handmaid of the Lord." In seeing this, I truly understood that she is greater in worthiness and fullness of grace than everything which God created below her, for no created thing is above her except the blessed humanity of Christ. This little thing that is made, that is beneath Our Lady St. Mary, God showed it me as small, as if it had been a hazelnut. Seemed to me as if it might have disintegrated into nothingness because of its smallness. In this blessed revelation, God showed me 3 nothings, of which nothings this is the first that was shown me. Every man and woman who longs to live life contemplatively needs to know this, that it should please them to count as nothing everything that is made, in order to have the love of God who is unmade. For this is the reason why those who deliberately occupy themselves in earthly business and are constantly seeking worldly success find no peace from this in heart or soul, because they love and seek rest here, in this thing which is so small and in which there is no rest, and do not know God, who is almighty, all-wise, and all good, for he is true rest. God wishes to be known, and this is the reason why no soul is at rest until it counts as nothing all that is created. When a soul has made itself as nothing for love, in order to have him who is all that is good, then he is able to receive spiritual rest. The book of Margery Kempe. When this book was first being written, the said creature was more at home in her chamber with the man doing the writing, and said fewer prayers than she had done for years before in order to speed the writing. And when she came to church to hear Mass, intending to say her matins and such other devotions as she had performed before, her heart was drawn away from recitation and much set upon meditation. She being afraid of the displeasure of our Lord, he said to her, "So, do not be afraid, daughter. For as many prayers as you would like to say, I accept them as though you said them. And your concentration on getting written down the grace that I have shown you pleases me greatly, and he who is doing the writing as well. For though you were in church and both wept together as bitterly as you ever did, you still would not please me more than you do with your writing. For, daughter, by this book, many a man shall be turned to me and believe." Also, while the said creature was occupied with the writing of this treatise, she had many holy tears and much weeping, and often there came a flame of fire about her breast, very hot and delectable, and also he that was writing for her could sometimes not keep himself from weeping. Yet, often in the meantime, when this creature was in church, our Lord Jesus Christ with his glorious mother and many saints as well came into her soul and thanked her, saying that they were all pleased with the writing of this book. And she heard also many times a voice of a sweet bird singing in her ear. And often she heard sweet sounds and melodies that surpassed her wit to tell of them. And she was many times ill while writing treatises like this, and while they were being written down, but as soon as she would set about the writing, then, in a sudden way, she was hale and healthy, and often she was commanded to make herself ready in haste. On one occasion, as she lay at her prayers in the church during the time of Advent before Christmas, she thought in her heart that she wished that God, of his goodness, would make Master Allen to preach a sermon as well as he could. And as soon as she had thought this way, she heard our sovereign Lord Jesus Christ saying in her soul, "Daughter, I know very well what you are thinking now about Master Allen, and I tell you truly that he shall preach a very holy sermon, and see that you believe steadfastly the words that he shall preach, as though I preached them myself. For they shall be words of great solace and comfort to you, for I shall speak in him. And when she heard this answer, she went and told it to her confessor and 2 other priests whom she greatly trusted. And when she had told them her feeling, she was sorry, for fear as to whether he would speak as well as she had felt or not. For revelations are hard sometimes to understand. Sometimes those that people think were revelations are deceits and delusions, and therefore it is not appropriate to give credence too readily to every stirring, but wait steadfastly and prove if they be sent from God. Nevertheless, as for this feeling of this creature, it was very truth, shown in experience, and her fear and her heaviness of heart turned into great spiritual comfort and gladness. Sometimes she was greatly depressed about her feelings, when she did not know how they should be understood for many days together, because of the dread that she had of deceptions and delusions, so that she thought she wished her head had been struck from her body, until God, in his goodness, explained them to her mind. For sometimes what she understood physically was to be understood spiritually. And the fear that she had of her feelings was the greatest scourge she had on earth, and especially when she had her first feelings. And that fear made her most meek, for she had no joy in the feeling until she knew by experience whether it was true or not. But ever blessed may God be, for he made her always more mighty and more strong in his love and his fear, and gave her increase of virtue with perseverance. Here ends this treatise, for God took him to his mercy who wrote the first copy of this book. And though he did not write clearly or openly to our manner of speaking, he in his own way of writing and spelling made true sense, which, through the help of God and of herself, who experienced all this treatise and feeling and acting, is now truly drawn out of that copy into this little book.
Thank you so much, Lisa, for these impossibly vivid readings. And thank you also to Bea for your energetic curation that's brought us all together. And thank you, everyone, for coming out this evening. So when Bea invited me to chair this event, I immediately thought back to an undergraduate module called Subjects of Desire. This introduced me to a key lens through which we can understand medieval texts. So that would be the construction of the writer's identity as a narrator and a religious person devoted to God rather than the devil, as well as mysticism as a place of multiple intersecting qualities and authorities. While tonight's event isn't going to be academic, and my undergraduate was such a long time ago, it may as well have been in the Middle Ages, so I can't really remember anything else about it. There are certain themes that remain fascinating to me and clearly have endured across centuries. So these themes include the presence of absence of a loved one, such as a mother or a daughter or God, and how to bear experiences that are larger than our comprehension, either due to being a child or to being mortal, as well as how to bear the emotional reverberations of such experiences. What are the frameworks by which we can understand visions, ecstasies, or extreme withdrawals from society? And finally, how can we make sense of all of this through art, and specifically the art of words? So I'm very happy to be joined by Siân Hughes and Victoria MacKenzie. By way of introducing myself, I'm Sarah Shin. I wear many hats. Tonight I am here as one of the founders of Silver Press, which began as a feminist publisher, and recently we are expanding with Spiral House, a new imprint for poetry, art, and ways of knowing. I'm also an amateur medievalist and mystical enthusiast. Victoria is a fiction writer and poet. She has won a number of writing prizes, including a Scottish Book Trust New Writers Award, and is the author of For Thy Great Pain, Have Mercy on My Little Pain, which imagines the encounter between Julian of Norwich and Margery Kempe. And then Siân, on the far left, is a writer who grew up in a small village in Cheshire where Pearl is set. Returning to live there after her mother's death, she borrowed from the medieval poem Pearl to write a story set in an old house she cycled past every day as a child. Her first collection of poetry, The Missing, won the Seamus Heaney Award, and Pearl, her first novel, was longlisted for the Booker Prize 2 years ago, so congratulations.
Thank you.
So just to start us off, I was wondering if you could introduce a little bit more about your understanding of the source text, because as we heard in Lisa's reading, there's such a huge variety of styles and references there. What was interesting to you about them, and how did you come to them, or how did they come to you? And I was thinking maybe I could ask you to start, Siân, if that's okay.
Okay.
Because I know that it's obsessed you for your whole lifetime. So.
Yeah, it has. Yeah, the poem Pearl, the medieval poem Pearl, that my book is named after, but is not. I haven't written a translation of at all. It's a response to, and it's more a story of a lifetime's obsession with it, rather than any kind of accurate translation or retelling. So I first read the poem Pearl as an undergraduate, but I wasn't a very good student. And I didn't understand a lot of it. It's quite hard to read. And then a little while later, I found out something that I probably should have picked up at the time, which was that it was written more or less where I grew up, in South Cheshire, which is why it's very hard to read for modern readers, though it's contemporary with Chaucer. Chaucer is quite readable because Chaucerian English obviously then became the English that we now speak. And the language that they were speaking in Cheshire didn't. So this poem is quite hard to read, and it's very, very intricate. It's so elaborate and beautifully made. It might be the most intricate poem ever written in English. It follows so many rules that the stanzas felt to me not so much rooms as cages, really intricate cages. They're so full of trickery and knots. But what is so memorable about it is this feeling of that the cages are there because the narrator of the poem is grieving the loss of his toddler daughter, who he says was not 2 years old when she died. And it's that extract that was read so movingly by Lisa is when he's on her grave and the flowers are on her grave, and the songs that he hears, he says in the silence, they're the most beautiful songs. And I always imagined that they must be his remembering his child singing, because he's got silence in his life, but it's the most beautiful sound he's ever heard that comes to him there. So what most people reading it remember, as I did, is not so much the elaborate cage as this flow of emotion through it, that no matter how beautiful the cage is that he makes, that the feeling just overflows. So I wouldn't attempt to translate it, it's so intricate, but what I wanted to put in a modern setting, and my book, unlike Victoria's book, which is an imagining of the setting at the time of those writers, it is set in the modern day, and it is set in my home village. And I think once I realised that the writer was from where I'm from, that the riverbank, which is the river of death in the poem, became just the riverbank just down the road from my village. And instead of, in my mind, the shining towers of the Book of Revelations and things on the other side of the river of death, I was seeing the muddy banks of the River Dee churned up by the hoof prints of the cows coming down to the water.
Thank you. So I'll say a little bit about each book, and then I'll say how I came to write the novel. So I'll begin with Revelations of Divine Love by Julian of Norwich. It's a book in which Julian describes some holy visions that she had when she was about 30. She was very close to death. She writes that she had a fever. Her priest had come and had given her last rites. She wasn't expected to live. Her mother was there. And she had a series of visions which she calls showings, a word that I really love. And she sees very viscerally scenes from the crucifixion and so on, and she describes them in what's called the short text, in quite a lot of vivid detail. And then we know that at some point after this, Julian became an anchoress, which I'm sure all of you in this audience will know, but in case you don't, it's much like a nun, but you commit to living in a single room for the rest of your life. And it's probably while Julian was an anchoress that she wrote the rest of her book, which is called The Long Text. And it's a work of great theological significance in which she explores in a much sort of greater depth these visions that she was given when she was close to death. It's written in Middle English, so it's more recent than Pearl, I think. But it's still not an easy read, so I'm not a medieval scholar. I read it in translation into modern English. And as far as we know, Julian wrote this book herself. There's no reason, scholars say there's no reason to doubt her authorship. So it's a book of theological beauty, it's very literary, it's very learned. There's very little about Julian herself in it. There's very little autobiographical detail. It's really just concentrating on these visions and their meaning. The book of Margery Kempe is quite different, as many of you will know. Margery was not an anchoress. She was a merchant's wife, mother to 14 children, and she also claimed to have holy visions. Unlike Julian's, hers weren't contained in a short period. They happened over the course of her life, the first one being not that long after the birth of her first child. And as far as we know, Margery wasn't particularly literate. And she dictated this book, which I should say about Julian's, it's the first known book in English by a woman. The book of Margery Kempe is the first known autobiography by a man or a woman in English. She dictated her life story to a scribe or a couple of scribes towards the end of her life, probably in her early 60s. And it's absolutely full of Margery, unlike Julian. So she tells us a great deal of detail about her everyday life, what she thinks of her neighbours, what they think of her, what she's wearing, what she's eating, all of her thoughts, and her visions as well. Her visions, sometimes they're quite bodily. Jesus comes to her, he sits on her bed, she talks with him. Sometimes they're more oral, it's just a conversation that she's having with him. People doubt her visions, and a lot of her book is about wrestling with worry about where these visions come from. Are they from the devil? Are people right that they come from the devil? Are they holy? And so on. She probably dictated it to her son initially. I think that's sort of widely believed. He had lived in Prussia for a long time. His English doesn't seem to have been great. His writing seems to have been awful. And when she gave it to a priest after her son had died to start again with her life story, she was very keen to tell her life story. He basically said he couldn't read the writing, so it was a sort of a second attempt. And it's quite bodged. It's, obviously she couldn't, it's a writer's nightmare. She couldn't redraft, she couldn't edit. So it's not chronological, it's quite, rambling and so on. And just incredibly different voice from Julian's. In terms of how I came to write the novel and to put these two women together, initially I had thought of writing a novel about Julian of Norwich. I knew that she had been an anchoress, and it just mesmerised me, this decision to lock yourself in one room. Why do that? Why give up so much? And so I began researching that, and I wanted to explore why someone might make that decision and live in one room. And I very quickly came across Margery Kempe. And I then very quickly came across the fact that the two women had met, and it just seemed meant to be that I would write the novel interweaving the women telling the stories of their lives and then bringing them together. We know they met because Margery says so in her book. And all she says is that she spent several days with the anchoress of Norwich and she got wise counsel. We don't know what they said to each other. So again, as a writer, there was that opportunity there to imagine what these two extraordinary women had to say to each other.
Thank you. I really liked how you described Margery's book as a chaotic text. And yeah, I mean, I was curious about why you chose to write novels, because both of you are poets as well. And the novel as being a modern form, I was curious about how you negotiated or engaged with or chose not to engage with perhaps medieval genres such as the now defunct consolatio, which appears in Pearl. And also, as poets, you know, were you concerned to bring a sense of spokenness and song and voice into your novels?
Do you want me to go?
I don't mind.
I think I felt a strong sense of narrative with, because I wanted to tell both women's lives. So I think for me the novel came quite naturally as a decision there. It's true that I did begin my writing life as a poet, and when I was shaping Julian's voice, I think I was sort of channeling some of those ideas from poetry about the kind of intensity of the image and the sort of contemplative moment of a lyric poem, for example. So I think those aspects of poetry found their way into the novel through Julian's voice rather than Margery's. And it was just as a writer, I found I can't tell you how much I enjoyed writing this novel, to put the calm, the contemplative, the literary voice of Julian next to the boastful, the rambunctious, the self-obsessed, the oversharing Margery. So there was just real pleasure there in kind of juxtaposing these two women, and it was kind of reveling in the different voices there. And you're right about that spokenness. I've given them both first-person narratives. So that I did want that sense of them speaking directly into the reader's ear almost, that kind of confiding voice of, you know, let me tell you something about myself. So yeah, that was a really important part of how I structured the whole thing, I think.
How much did you draw from the original texts in their voices?
In terms of voice, quite a bit. So, as I say, Julian's quite literary. She tends to use a lot of beautiful rhythm. She uses the rule of three, for example, in her very well-known phrase, all shall be well and all shall be well and all things shall be well. That kind of literary device, or very rhetorical. So I tried to channel those aspects of Julian from her text, as well as the kind of visceralness of her descriptions of her visions and so on. With Margery, I think I'd tried to capture something of the energy of her voice. You know, there's a real sense that she just can't tell you enough about everything, and also so emotional as well. You know, she's a woman who's full of anxiety and always worrying about what other people think of her, and always suffering and so on. So those aspects, rather than, you know, any kind of more literary aspects, are important.
Yeah, she was absolutely incorrigible.
She's wonderful.
Yes.
Yeah.
And how about you, Siân? In Pearl, there's multiple voices and genres going on as well, because you have fairy tales, you have songs. Would you like to speak a bit about that?
Well, yeah, there are songs and fairy tales and things in them, and I think that because I've written there's like versions of this book quite a few times until I got one that was okay enough. And I think that probably one of the things that was holding me back as a novelist was that training in poetry and the beauty of the original text, that desire to tidy everything up, and that everything should already be decided by the form. And of course in a novel you can't have that. You know, what you really need in a novel is the possibility that characters might change. They might grow, they might experience, they might change. And so you have to let them start talking. You have to let them start doing their own thing. So the narrator is the same all the way through, and the book relies entirely on her voice, on Marianne's voice. And obviously her voice, like all of ours, contains the voices of other people who have taught you and the songs that you heard as a child. So, and the snippets of different things that make up your voice. So yes, she does tell her mother's local stories, which are my mother's local stories from our village, myths of murder and mayhem, all sorts of stuff, passed down in villages. And also the songs that she sang in the playground, or that her mother sung to her. So where bits of like that poetic structure have come in, they've come in like as the little songs that start each chapter. I wanted something that looked a bit like the original, in that it was in sections, and each section has like a little link word that links that one to the next. So I wanted the songs to be like the little links. So to me, songs were really, really important all the way through it. And in my mind, the original poem, the songs that the dreamer hears when he's on the grave and in the silence, they were really important. So I spent ages like choosing songs for the book and threading lots of song all the way through it. And then I thought, well, I better go back and check the reference to songs in the original, that I haven't just made this up totally. So I go back through and try to look for them, and it's half a line long. Now, this poem is a whole book of a poem. It's massive. And to me, these songs were so important. They were the method by which the dreamer could move from one state to another. He could move from awake to asleep. He could move from present into the past. He could move into the spiritual world where he could talk to his dead daughter. So it was like the transport of the whole thing. The poems, the songs, in the way that, sometimes a snippet of a song will take you back in time, like a smell can, or something that would just like connect you. So you're here, present, but like a part of you's gone off somewhere else, and it's the song that's taken you there. So I thought these songs were massively important. I was very disappointed to find that in the original, in fact, it was only half a line long, and I just imagined that they were massively important, which I think goes to show that you start off with this inspiration text, and I'm sure is the same in this one. I absolutely loved Victoria's book, and I loved the different voices. That the original gets left behind because the voice in the book takes over, and you let the character lead you off somewhere else. Hopefully. Hopefully it takes over.
I loved hearing you speak about the songs. I had the image of the river in the book, as you were saying about how it flows. And I'd really love to hear more about your process, really, because you said that you rewrote it several times. How did that all happen?
Well, yeah, when I started writing it, I started writing, I had a set of characters that were in this old house that was falling down, and there were lots and lots of them. So the family started off with like far too many people in it. Every time I rewrote it, I had to kill off some more of them until there's hardly any left. By the time you get to this really small family, by the time you get to this one, these characters had been sort of knocking around in my head, talking to each other, and I knew where they came from and all this to it for a long, long time. And then in my 20s, a friend of mine took his life by drowning in a river. And as an act of, I think, probably an expression of the angry stage of grief, I had all the names of my characters on the page, and I stuck my pen on, and it landed on the person who I was going to make go into the river. And I chose the hardest one. Freud probably says I knew exactly where the pen was going. I promise I wasn't cheating. I closed my eyes totally. But anyway, it gave me a big problem, this character, because I didn't know why they would do it. So I don't know how other people write mysteries, whether the writer knows what the mystery is when they start. Or I don't know how people write detective novels or things where, does the writer know who's done it right from the beginning? I don't know. But I didn't know what the mystery was. I didn't know why she'd done it. I didn't know how it had come about. And I think that's why it took me so long to write, because obviously that's a very, very bad piece of plotting on my part, isn't it? It shows that plot is really not my strength, because it took me all those years to try and work out why she'd do it. Because I had no idea when I began. I just kept writing, hoping one day it would become clear to me, basically. I don't recommend it as a method of writing a book, by the way. It's just like a really, really bad tutorial. Anyone who's trying to write a novel out there, whatever you do not set out and then 40 years later work out what your plot was, please.
I suspect that that's what's going to happen to my novel. But I loved it. I loved the sort of layering and the sort of deconstructed feel of the story, that the plot does not feel tight. I like that because Marianne is also, as she's getting older, she's developing more structures for comprehending what's happened. So you're discovering little reflections and mirrors from the original Pearl sort of embedded in as well. Would you like to speak a bit about your structure? How did you come to it? Because yours is quite different.
Yeah, so as I said, with Julian's book, there's almost nothing about her. In fact, she even exhorts the reader not to think about her, but to focus on her visions and what they might teach us. So as a writer, I really had a blank canvas there to invent Julian's entire life, effectively, and to think about... we know so little about her. I researched, medieval women and anchorites and so on, but there's very little concrete evidence of Julian, and whether she married or whether she had children, whether she was a nun before she became an anchoress, all of that is in doubt. So I wanted to think about why you might become an anchoress, and part of the reason was probably that she needed to reflect on these showings. She felt that God had given them to her for a reason, that they were important, and that she needed essentially the time and space to think about it. And as a medieval woman, very few options for getting time and space to think about things. And what I discovered when I was researching the life of the anchorite or anchoress is that actually it was a position with enormous kudos and privileges, despite its obvious privations, that you were in some sense protected from society in your cell, you were looked after, you had a maid bring your food and so on, and if you so desired, you could have reading matter, and you could have time to think, and you could have time to write. And it started to actually seem like quite a good idea for a medieval woman. So that was one reason why she perhaps became an anchoress, but I also wanted to give more personal elements. So I invented a kind of a life story for Julian when she was younger, that may have sort of driven her to become an anchoress. So that was Julian. With writing Margery, I had so much about her in her book, but I also had this sense when I first read the book of Margery Kempe that although things are very obvious about her sort of boastfulness and her oversharing and her worries, I also was moved by her. I felt this is a woman who's lonely, this is a woman who's fragile, this is a woman who's trying to reach out and find her place in society. And it was really important to me when I was creating Margery as a character that she wasn't just a laughing stock. And so when she goes to meet Julian, I have Julian say, when she hears Margery's voice, because the anchoress can't look at people, she has to draw this curtain across the window. She hears Margery's voice and she thinks, this is the loneliest woman I've ever met. And it was really important for me to bring that kind of empathy for Margery into the book. So I've interwoven the two voices as they tell you in first person about who they are and about their lives. When they met, Julian was probably quite close to the end of her life, but Margery was only 40 and she went on to live for another 20 years, and in that time she went on a number of extraordinary pilgrimages to Santiago de Compostela, to Rome, to Jerusalem, and I actually started writing some of those scenes because they're wild. Margery's the kind of person who could fall out, with the chair she's sitting on, essentially. So to get to Jerusalem, you would go to Venice first, and then you would take a boat. And she falls out with a priest on the boat. She accuses him of stealing her pillow. The other pilgrims, because you have to go in a group for safety, the other pilgrims hated her. They wouldn't let her eat with them. They cut her dress to humiliate her, so she's going around in this mini skirt. She's deeply humiliated, and it was such wonderful material. But as I was writing the novel, I realised that I couldn't include these scenes because I wanted to bring the novel to a close with the meeting. And Julian, she doesn't live much longer. So to have another 20 years of Margery, I felt would really overbalance the structure. So those scenes had to go. So if you want to, read the joyousness of Margery on Pilgrim, just simply read the book of Margery Kempe. It's all there. But yes, so I simply led it up to this point of this meeting, essentially.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed specifically how Julian really wants to learn how to write. And writing is such a theme, a huge theme, the textuality of the text itself in the originals, and which you bring to life in your reimagination. And something that really struck me was the care and the attention that you've paid to the emotional qualities of their lives. In the reading that Lisa gave, Margery, there's a part where they describe Margery as being depressed, or Margery describes herself as being depressed, which I thought was quite funny because surely depression is a modern term. And perhaps we'll pick up on sort of frameworks for these understandings later. But I was thinking to ask you to speak a bit more about this emotional matrix that you express through fiction, that at the time perhaps they could only really find space to do within these religious purposes. So did you relate in any way to the religion or faith?
I think both women suffer emotionally enormously, and I'm afraid I inflict imaginative suffering on Julian before she becomes an anchoress. I give her a series of bereavements and so on, and I didn't she's well known for her phrase, all should be well and all should be well and all things shall be well, and I feel like I didn't want that to feel a glib phrase. I think what comes through in Julian's own writing is a sense of her awareness of suffering in the world. And so I wanted to kind of make that personal, if you like. And then when she has these visions and she has these sort of spiritual understandings, she sees that suffering on earth is as nothing, that you could shake it out like a cloth, because all that matters is then you are embraced by God's love. And mysteriously, and she doesn't understand how, mysteriously he shall make all things well. And it doesn't matter that we as humans with our limited understanding don't know how that can happen. We just have to trust in it. And I just found, I'm not someone of religious faith myself, but I found Julian's understanding of theology so inclusive and embracing. She acknowledges that the church is concerned with sin, and she doesn't wish to be heretical, so she often will repeat the phrase in her book, I believe in all things that the true church teaches, or a phrase similar to that. So she's sort of covering her back a bit. But she also says that when she sees heaven, there's no sin there. All that matters is God's love, and it's God's love that gives everything being. And I just found that such a, it's just such a positive theology, I suppose. It wasn't, the God-fearing, the punishing, fire and brimstone or anything. It was all about, if you love God, then everything will be fine. And I found that very, very warm and inclusive. With Margery, yes, she suffers enormously too, mostly through her own thoughts, her own kind of depression or melancholia and her anxieties about these visions, and she shares them with everyone all the time, and she runs enormous risks by doing so. It's another positive about Margery, is that bravery, actually. She risked being arrested for heresy. The punishment at that time was to be burnt at the stake, so it's enormous risks she's taking and talking about her visions. But she says that God says to her, the more she suffers on earth, the more she'll be loved and rewarded, in heaven, which is very much music to Margery's ears and helps to comfort her, I suppose, with what she perceives as her own suffering. Yeah. And as a novelist, you just try to make these things as tangible as you can. And when you're writing about women who lived 600 years ago, to just try and bring that empathy to them for a modern audience.
Thank you. And the texture of grief that permeates Pearl is incredibly moving. Would you like to speak a bit more about faith in the animism as well?
Yeah, so the poem Pearl, even though obviously it's a religious poem in some ways, because the dreamer, when he falls asleep on his daughter's grave, and he describes his daughter as the pearl, is sort of heretical already, because the pearl of great price, for which you should sacrifice everything else from a scriptural point of view, is God's love, is salvation. He's saying that the pearl that he's lost is his daughter. So he's saying that his earthly love, his love as a parent for his child, is the pearl of great price. And that without it, he's in despair, which is sort of echoing the scripture a bit, sort of saying if you don't have God's love and salvation, then you're in despair and you are living in hell. He's saying he's living in hell because he misses his little girl. And so he's already heretical. And then he goes and he finds himself basically in an animated version of the book of Revelations, with all of the different forests and the silver on the trees and the fruit. And he goes and he finds on the other side of the river, there is the whole of the, heavenly city of the book of Revelations, which is a totally bonkers book, by the way. It's a totally bonkers book. And, somebody's counted everything and measured it. Why? Why does God need to tell us how he's... I don't know. Anyway, so there is the bank of angels, and out of the bank of angels walks this young woman who's not a toddler anymore. She's a young woman. And she basically recites the teachings of the church. She tells him what he's supposed to think as a Christian and how he's supposed to feel about her death as a Christian. This seems to me like a massive expression of doubt, because if you give the official voice of the church to a toddler or to a child who's really quite cold to her father, she's quite critical of him. I mean, even though she's grown up a bit, she's still a bit like a toddler, stamping her foot and saying, "Oh, silly daddy, you've got it all wrong, don't you understand about God," And the characterisation of the young girl is really, really moving, because she speaks to him in such an intimate way. And she recites the teaching of the church, and he says, "I can't swallow that, I can't bear that, I don't want to wake up and find myself back in my life without you. I want to cross this river of death and be with you." Which is basically saying, I reject the teachings of the church because my suffering is too intense. I would rather die. It's a suicidal notion. So to give the official wisdom of the church to a child who is being very unfeeling and toddlerish about what it really is like to live and suffer, seems to me that the poem is an expression of intense religious doubt. And I suppose that was what really, really interested me about it, was that this is supposedly a religious poem and it contains lots of references to the Bible, that it doesn't express the official version of the church teachings. It expresses one person's very personal, overwhelming feeling of sadness that blows that all away. And I suppose that was what I was trying to, though I haven't written a translation in any sense, I wanted to impose on my characters a feeling of such desolation that they would feel that everything that they had believed in up to that point has been blown away. All the certainties of life, everything that they counted on before that loss, as to be nothing now.
Could you speak a bit more about what you call the paganism of Marianne's mother, and maybe in relation to the landscape as well?
Yeah, so to me it feels perfectly natural to have Christian and pagan doctrines all mixed up together, because my mother believed everything, and she believed in ghosts and all these, and revenants and ancient pagan rituals. And the church in my village, which starts off the book at the Wakes Festival, and the Wakes Festival happens every year. It's like grave dressing, and it happens at harvest time, and there's a big festival and everyone gets drunk, and there's a big party, and they think that probably the Wakes goes back pre-Christian. There were probably people meeting on that piece of ground before they built a church on it, sacrificing some animals and staying up all night and reciting the names of the dead in a sort of ritual. And there's a sort of version of it that's been passed down. So to me, like, the pagan beliefs of the countryside are all wrapped up in it being all happening in the same place and becoming the same parties and ways that we measure the year that still go on. We still do have that festival, and it's probably at least 3,000 years old. So that seemed totally natural to me. There's always a bit of wish fulfillment in a novel as well. And my mother, because she believed in ghosts, and I always used to say to her that I didn't, and she'd be very cross with me. And so after she died, I completely believed that she was going to come back and say, "I told you so." And I had no idea really that I was I was waiting for that, you know, because obviously I'd been saying forever, like, not nonsense, you know. And I was so disappointed that she didn't. I was so cross, you know. And so I in my novel, I've given Marianne regular visitations from her ghostly mother, and that I've given Marianne that thing that I really wanted. So she has a sort of ongoing relationship with her dead mother, and her ghostly visions are very physical and real.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you more about the ghostly visions, but I realised that I didn't let the audience know that there'll be time for questions after a panel, which will wrap up at some point quite soon. So please do ask away quite soon, and I'll invite them in. So yeah, with the visions, I mean, the visions, the visitations, there's many ways in which people have sought to understand them and sort of explain them. Also, when you were speaking a bit earlier about the dream visions of the man in Pearl, I was thinking, gosh, it sounds like he maybe found like a hallucinogenic plant or something. And there are some theories that think that Christianity actually was a mushroom cult or began from a mushroom cult. And, you know, some people might explain the visions through migraines or like a medicalization of the body. So I was wondering if you might be able to speak a bit more about that.
That's really relevant to your book, isn't it? Because it's so easy to medicalise those things.
Yeah, absolutely. So as I said, Julian had her showings, you know, basically at the point of almost dying with a terrible fever. So I think from a modern point of view, you know, many of us can be doubtful or a little uncomfortable at the idea of these intense holy visions coming to a person, and you know, suspect that they were visions, hallucinations brought about by her illness. With Margery, the first time that Christ comes to her is not that long after the birth of her first child, and she gives us great detail about what a difficult pregnancy and a difficult birth she had. She's actually, you know, shackled to the bed before she gives birth by her husband because she's kind of raving. And when Christ comes to her, she is restored to her senses. And I think, you know, from a modern point of view, it's very easy to put labels like postpartum psychosis to Margery's visions. But because I was writing a novel in 1413 and I was writing first-person narratives, I didn't really want to bring in that kind of modern perspective on their visions. It really was important to me that I took these women at their word. They had these visions. I was good with that. So what I did is I've given the reader the information about Julian's fever. I've described this fever. You know that Margery has the visions after the birth of her first child. But really, I've left it open for the reader. If people want to give those medical explanations, you know, then that's absolutely fine. But if you want to go with the idea that these were mystical holy visions, then that's also absolutely open to the reader. Mm-hmm. So the great thing about the novel is you don't have to come to a conclusion. You can just juxtapose things and give images and metaphors and let the reader do it.
I don't want to give away the ending or anything too much about these novels. It's always very tricky to not give away too much, but I do want to sort of touch upon the fact that your visitations, or Marianne's visitations, are very sort of, there's a lot of sensory dimension to it. So. Yeah,
so she knows that it's her mother coming because it smells like her mother's hands, which smell like the garden, which obviously goes right back to the poem that is, there's a smell of these herbs and these scents that are sort of consoling, but they can also travel in time. And so she knows that it's her mother who climbs into her bed and reassures her that she's okay, because she can smell the mint on her fingers from the garden, and because the dent in the bed smells like her mother. She knows that she was there. But every time her mother is there, she knows it's her because of the particular way that her mother's voice cracks when she laughs, or that there's some sensory clue that her mother is sitting next to her on the bus having a chat about where she's just been. And I again, very, very like Vicky, I didn't want to medicalise or explain away Marianne's spiritual life, if you like. Even though she, because it's a modern novel, she does get challenged by her community midwife and, like, is there a history of postpartum psychosis? And she does have to be treated for it. Her first impulse is to say, no, there's a history of grief. That it's my grief flowing through me, and the grief has been passed on by my mother's milk, and I'm passing it on again, and I'm passing it on like I'm singing a song. I didn't want it to be, I'm passing it on because I've got an inherited predisposition to postpartum psychosis. It was like, I'm passing it on because this is who I am, and this is how I experience life, and to leave, like, her experience of it as the vivid thing, rather than slapping a label or an explanation on it. So I did want to leave it totally open at the end. Somebody might, as a modern reader, go, well, clearly this person's still poorly, because, your classic time for being vulnerable to hallucinogenic illnesses, like between 3 and 4 in the morning, it's the middle of the night, her mother's coming to her bed, she's clearly still poorly. Or maybe her mother comes into her bed to help her. Yeah.
Well, your beliefs will create your reality, and as novelists, obviously your material is reality in a way. And today we might say that there should be a crisis of faith in what we believe, which is that everything is explicable, because it's not. But yeah, I mean, like, writing, creation, making sense of things through art is a really big feature across all of the texts that we're looking at today, from the original sources to your novels. And I was wondering if you could speak a bit more about that. So for example, Marianne becomes an artist.
Yeah, so I'll go first on this one. Yeah, so I wanted, because I always wanted Marianne to survive. I wanted her to be able to live with her past and contain it and move through with her life. I always, of all of the siblings that I killed off from my original collection, she was the one I was never going to kill off, because she was the one who I felt was going to be okay. And so I gave her what I felt she needed to survive. So I gave her a daughter, and I gave her art. So she becomes an artist, because I felt that if she had those two things, that she would be okay.
Yeah, so in my novel, one of the themes is very much about writing.
Yes.
And the importance of writing, and the way that writing can give you power, and the way that writing can help you to understand yourself and your own identity within your world. So as far as we know, Julian wrote her own book, and so I needed imaginatively to consider how this woman learned how to read and write. So I concoct a story about how Julian learns to read, and I make her someone very passionate and obsessed with wanting to learn to read and write. It seems to her like something almost magical, to be able to interpret marks on the page, to be able to make marks on the page and have another person come and to hear words in their head. And I suppose that's how I feel about reading and writing. It's a telepathy, it's astonishing. And then in her cell, it's something that steadies her, I think. I didn't want her to have an easy time of it. I'll become an anchoress. I'm going to live in this cell. Easy. I wanted it to be an emotional struggle, something that she had to really use her spiritual strength to wrestle with and come to terms with this life in the cell. And so writing, became something that she could focus her mind on, something where she was exploring these visions and feeling that it was the right thing to do, that this was what God wanted her to do. We don't know how Julian got her manuscript out of the cell, as far as I know. We can trace the manuscript later, but there's a sort of mystery surrounding the manuscript within Julian's own life. And she was known as an anchoress, but she wasn't really known for her visions at all, so it was something quite secret to her. With Margery, it's just fascinating what inspired a woman who's probably illiterate to decide to write an autobiography, which is not a thing that existed. And I have sort of imagined how that thought process might have come about, and imagined how Margery might have felt that it gave her some control over her own narrative, that she could shape her sense of self through writing, in her case dictating. And we know that Margery was very familiar with texts through preachers coming to her town. So she knew about the lives of certain holy women, and they made a big impression of her, like Bridget of Sweden. And I think that perhaps Margery was trying to tell the story of her own life, but modelling it on these lives of other holy women, and it was how she wanted to see herself. And I think Margery would very much have liked to have been made a saint. Perhaps it's something we could make happen.
I think so. I mean, it's clear that the uncertainty around these women's lives has left such a wide imaginative space for you. Why do you think that there's so much interest in medieval women? I feel like this is a question I should have asked first, but here we are.
I think I can only really answer it in terms of my own interest. I think there's something, when I started researching the medieval period, I was really struck by actually how tangible it felt. Those 600 years just seem to melt away when you're thinking about what did they actually eat, what did their clothes feel like, what music did they listen to. And I think as a historical novelist, one of the things that historical fiction can do is to take a historical, the facts, the kind of broad sweep of history, and then shrink it down and think what was lived experience like. And so to use that tangibility of life and to think, through sensory detail, through the life of the body. So that was really important to me to kind of to inhabit these women in that way.
Feels like the body is really, really important as well. Mentioning clothes earlier on, I think you were saying, Sean, that there was a lot of washing.
Yeah, there's a lot of detail of clothes.
Yeah.
A lot of detail of clothes. I mean, that picture really doesn't do any justice to the description of the Pearl Maiden's clothes in the Pearl poem. There's a huge amount of detail about, how they're stitched and where the pearls are, where the embroidery is, and where the sleeves are cut through, and like the way the bodice is made and the way her hair has been dressed. There's like such detail of like how you would make the clothes, and it's all part of the comfort of seeing that his daughter's so well looked after. And has led some people to speculate whether it could be written by a woman, because we say, well, who would know so much about making the clothes and keeping them so nice and about doing her hair? I don't know. It's a bit of an outlandish theory that it was written by a woman. It'd be nice to imagine it could have been, though, wouldn't it? Really, really unlikely, apparently. But it would be nice to imagine that somebody who knew what it was like to stitch those clothes and dress children in them also wrote it down.
Yeah.
Wouldn't that be lovely?
Well, I think that maybe there were many people who didn't have such fine clothing. In the exhibition, there's so much about health and sickness. And there was a lot of suffering, and it seems like death was round every corner, essentially. The fact that Margery survived 14 children is really extraordinary.
Yeah, in the exhibition there's some horrendous statistic about 1 in 20 aristocratic women died in childbirth. And I think Margery found childbirth and mothering a tough gig.
Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, on the clothes thing, Margery's obsessed with her clothes. She has a new cloak, and she has slashes in it so you can see the fine coloured silks underneath. It's like the latest fashion in Norfolk. She's very pleased with herself.
Yeah.
So, those sorts of details, I think, just really conjure a period.
Yeah. And was that in the exhibition that you saw, the Margery's clothing?
Oh, no, it's in her book. She goes on and on about what she wears. Yeah. She's very concerned with what her neighbours have, and that hers are the finest.
That's incredible.
Yeah, if you read the sumptuary laws about what you're allowed to wear, but I mean, they were only writing those laws down because women like Margery were all flouting the laws like crazy all over the place. Like they only had, so keen to keep on rewriting and saying, no, merchant women are not allowed to wear all of the following things. Like, why would they have needed to write it down if they weren't? They clearly all were.
That's also a huge question about how we have these records and the writing of history and so on. But I'm very aware that it's time for audience questions. So I believe that we have a couple of roving mics. Thank you. There's a question over here. Thank you.
You mentioned that preachers would come to villages and tell people what were in books. Were there other ways that people would find out what was written in books? And what do you think the authors, who do you think the authors were imagining would be reading their books?
Oh, I have no idea what the authors would have imagined people reading their books, because obviously if anybody found out that Julian of Norwich had written her book and claimed to have visions, she could have been killed as a heretic. And Margery was threatened constantly throughout her life with that, just not for writing it down, but just for claiming that she was in contact with God. That was enough to get her killed, wasn't it? So the idea that they would have an audience and live to see it would have been an extraordinary idea, really. Yeah.
I think with Margery we don't know, and that's my understanding. And her writings disappeared for a long time. It's not really something we touched on, but there were excerpts in the 15th century, but very much boulderized versions of her book, and to the extent that people thought she had been an anchoress herself, which just goes to show how much of Margery had been taken out, just sort of leaving some quite holy parts. And then there's the wonderful ping pong story of how her book came to be discovered, which I'm sure many of you will know, but as a country house in Derbyshire, a weekend party, a game of ping pong, and a guest inadvertently trod on the ping pong ball, putting it out of service. A cupboard was raided for a spare, and lo and behold, a whole stack of manuscripts fell out. Before the owner could burn them in fury at all this rubbish around, someone pulled out the book of Margery Kempe, and it was subsequently identified. So yeah, I mean, if I could go back in time and ask one person one question, I would ask Margery, what possessed you to write the first known autobiography? Of an ordinary woman. It's such a remarkable medieval text that we have that, usually it's so much in terms of legal documents or noble women, but Margery was a merchant's wife, and we have so much detail of her everyday life. It's such a special book.
Incredible. One at the back over here. Oh, and also B, would you like to ask from the audience, or there's a lady over there?
I'm really intrigued by Margery being the mother of 14 children. I'm the mother of 5 children, and I want to go to Venice and Santiago, but I just don't have time. So, is there much in the book about that relationship to motherhood and how she organised her life to be able to do all these things?
That's a great question, and the very simple answer is there's almost nothing about her children, which is another extraordinary feature of the book. She tells us that she's the mother of 14. We don't know whether these are children who survived or if it was just 14 births. We don't know that. The only child, as far as I can remember, that she ever really mentions is her eldest son, John, who goes to live in Prussia. And this absence of children really struck me when I was reading it, because, as you say, 14, that's a lot. I mean, because she was merchant class, she would have had some help, some servants and so on. I think by the time she goes on her pilgrimages, most of her children would have been quite old, potentially. She had John when she was 20, and she doesn't go to Jerusalem until her 40s. So he was grown up. But yeah, it's a real glaring absence in the book. And it was something that I wanted to address in my novel, actually. I have Julian ask her a few questions about those children when they meet up. And Julian has a few ideas about motherhood as well that she shares with Margery. So that was something that really struck me.
We've a question from our online audience, and it comes from Joe Banks. And Joe asks, what do you think Margery Kempe and Julian of Norwich could teach us today?
Gosh, I think with Julian, in terms of her actual book rather than the novel, the stuff I made up, I think her theology is, as I said, remarkably inclusive, in that sort of emphasis on love and something I think is something that even people without religious faith find very resonant. I do think there's something to be said, not for full anchoress, but for her attitude of calm contemplation and sort of dwelling on the small things, and that kind of, I don't know, I suppose I'm going to say mindfulness at this point. So I feel like she's quite resonant with a lot of contemporary ideas in that way. Margery, I mean, my goodness, imagine if she'd had Instagram. She would just have had, 1 billion followers, I think. She was just someone who struggled, but really shared her struggles. And so I think she might have made a wonderful, I don't know, maybe a wonderful agony aunt or something, or she would have had a reality TV show. Perhaps what we learn from Margery is how not to be. But at the same time, I always say, okay, if you're going to have a party and you could only invite Margery or Julian, of course you'd invite Margery. But if you wanted a friend to go and confide in and have comfort, you'd go to Julian. So yeah, both women serve very different needs, I think.
There's a wonderful bit in the reading that Lisa was reading from Margery, where Margery's explaining that God is telling her that it's a really good idea that she writes this book. Pardon me. And I thought how useful that would be as a writer.
Yeah, God gives her great validation. Whenever Margery doubts herself, God says, no, Margery, you're doing the right thing.
So keep doing your book, Sian. God's on your side. He wants you to write it.
Do you have any more questions?
Take a sip of water.
I feel like, is that what faith is really? You have all these questions and doubts about life, and then you're like, oh, it's okay, God sanctioned it, or there's many answers there. And I feel like this might be the natural closing point where we've arrived at this, I don't know, the absolute, the everything that's containable within a hazelnut and everywhere all at the same time. So thank you to everybody for coming out tonight. Thank you to Bea again and to Lisa for reading. And thank you so much to you, Vicky, and so to you, Sian, and to all of the people who aren't with us today, but are with us in their words.
Thank you.
Thank you.